So let's talk about interest rates and aggregate demand. How do interest rates affect aggregate demand? And remember that this whole thing is about the real and the nominal, right? Interest rates are nominal things. And we're asking, how do they affect real things? How do they affect real GDP? How does something that's nominal, that's out there in the monetary system, affect how many cars we make? Right? And Ben Bernanke, other people are going to say there's a connection in there, and that connection is sticky prices. That nominal things affect real things in the short run because prices are sticky, but they don't necessarily affect things in the long run. Now, again, there are other economists. If you're Keynes, right, long run, we're all dead, right? So Keynes is going to argue that the nominal things are always affecting the real things, and you shouldn't even worry about thinking about they're not. But the standard theory says that these things are connected only by this sticky prices thing. Okay? So, do interest rates affect how much we consume? Well, of course they do. They affect when we buy a house, when we buy a car. They affect how we're using our credit cards. Interest rates are important, right? AOC and Bernie and some other folks have introduced legislation in Congress to try to limit credit card rates to no more than 15%. Okay? It's a big deal. It affects people's consumption. What the interest rate on the credit card is, home loans, car loans. Right? Are businesses affected by interest rates? Well, of course they are. If I'm thinking about, buying and building a new factory or buying a new truck from a business, what the interest rate is affects that. If I want a new truck and the bank wants 10% to get a truck loan, I'm not interested in paying the bank 10% for a loan on a truck. If it's 1.6%, 0.9%, okay, probably willing to pay that. So interest rates affect businesses' willingness to invest. And then the differences in interest rates between countries affect how many imports and exports we have, right? So if interest rates are high in the United States and low in England, that would encourage British people to bring their money to the United States. If interest rates are high in England and low in the United States, then that encourages U.S. people to take their money to England. Did we see that? Yeah. In the period of time in those years in between when the United States didn't have a central bank, England used to do that to us all the time. When England was having financial problems, they would adjust their interest rates relative to U.S. interest rates and suck all the money out of the United States because there was nobody in the United States to fight back. So that used to happen to the U.S. all the time, where all of a sudden everybody would wake up one morning and there'd be no money in New York. It would all have gotten on boats and headed to England because the British Bank of England was playing games with the United States. Okay? We cool there? All right. So, increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates is called expansionary monetary policy. Increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates is called expansionary monetary policy. How does it show up in our aggregate and demand and supply graph? Well, it shows up this way. If we increase the money supply, which lowers interest rates, we're going to shift the aggregate demand curve out to the right. It's going to increase real GDP. We're going to create jobs, right? Prices are going to go up some, but an expansionary monetary policy, an increase in the money supply and lowering interest rates in the short run should increase real GDP and create jobs. Okay? It should. In the short run, should do those things because it affects our buying cars and houses. It affects businesses investing. Okay? So increasing the money supply, lowering interest rates, gets consumers to buy more, gets businesses to invest more, shifts that aggregate demand curve to the right, increases real GDP, creates jobs in the short run. If you believe in this theory, and again, that's an optional thing to do, you can decide, but if you believe in this theory, all that's going to do is raise prices. So in the long run, in the short run, you might create jobs, but as the system works itself out and works its way through, that increase in money that you use temporarily to create jobs is going to create inflation. Okay? Did the Fed worry about this when they put a whole bunch of money in? So 2007, 8, 9, the Fed puts trillions of dollars out into the system to try to fight the effects of the financial crisis. And while they were doing that, they would publicly say things about, eventually, and then as time went on and the economy improved, they say, we're working on plans to pull that back. Well, why would they work on plans to pull that back? Because there's a belief, and we'll talk about this more over the next couple chapters, but there's clearly a belief that this turns into that. So if you leave all those trillions of dollars sitting out there for a long period of time, they're going to transform, and instead of creating jobs, they're going to cause inflation. So that happened 2007, 8, 9. Did they pull that money back? No, they didn't. Did inflation happen? No. And that, we're not quite ready to leap into the next chapter, but that's really what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Okay? Now, the Fed seems to be winging it, right? They do this and then they do that, and we have all these facilities, and we got this. There are many economists who believe that the Fed should have a very explicit set of rules, and they should follow a set of rules. They should publish the Fed book, and in that book it says, if this happens, we will do this, and if this happens, we will do that. And they should follow a set of rules. And the most famous rule proposal, in the old days, Milton Friedman had a rule proposal, and that was the most famous rule proposal, but the Fed abandoned Milty's rule as unworkable. The most famous current rule is the Taylor rule. And if you're looking at this picture, yes, indeed, that is Professor Taylor from Stanford. And yes, he is lecturing to all of us in BEH 241. So we actually had, in the spring before we all got locked up, in the spring of 2020, Professor Taylor came to UNLV and talked to us about monetary policy in the modern world. So we're all fresh and up to date. Yes? All right. So the Taylor rule says the Fed funds rate should be whatever the rate of inflation is, plus the equilibrium real rate. Remember that real means taking inflation out. So inflation plus the equilibrium interest rate without inflation in it, that's logical that those two things would be separate. And then allowances for gaps. Do you remember back over here, right? In this graph. This line is potential. This line is where we should be. If we're to the left of this line, we're out here somewhere, or to the right of the line, we're out here somewhere, we say a gap exists. And that means that we're not on this line. We're out away from the line, and the distance we're out away from the LRAS, from where we want to be, is called a gap. So if we're here, we have a gap to potential GDP that's going to cause unemployment, right? We need to try to get over there so that we don't have unemployment, okay? These gaps. So allowances for gaps. There are other proposed rules besides the Taylor rule, but the Taylor rule is by far the most commonly cited rule as the rule we should follow. And in fact, even though the Fed used to work really in secret and they didn't tell you what they do, if they weren't following the Taylor rule for a long time, it certainly looked like they were following the Taylor rule for a long time. Okay? Now, the Fed says in the modern world, the Fed's written down stuff, and they actually, one of the things the Fed has done that is very good, that started, sort of started with Alan Greenspan, but then really got serious with Bernanke and Yellen, is that they tell you everything. The Fed used to have meetings and decide things and not tell anybody what they had decided or what they were thinking, what their rules were, and people had to try to guess. So for a long time, they didn't tell us what they were doing, but it sure seemed like they were following the Taylor rule. All right? Now the Fed says, look, we don't think it's a good idea to follow rules. One reason is that the rule requires us to estimate things. Do we really know what the equilibrium real interest rate is? Or are we sort of guessing what it is? Do we really know what the gap is, or are we sort of guessing what it is? So there's a question about how well we know the value of the numbers that have to go into this rule. Okay? So that's number one question they have. And number two question they have, or number two reason they said not to follow a rule, is times they are a-changing. Things always change. And if you set up some rules and say we're going to follow these rules, maybe some emergency happens that's really not covered by the rules, or the rule says you should do X when it seems clear to everybody that X isn't going to solve this particular problem, that we need to do Y. So they want more flexibility than the rules allow, because the world is, changing. But something to think about. Would it make sense for the Fed to have a playbook and have a way that they can deviate from the playbook if they need to, but to have some kind of rule that you know pretty much what the Fed's going to do? Okay? So a couple little pieces that are related to all this. One is that monetary policy is subject to what we call lags. So if the Fed lowers interest rates tomorrow, is everybody going to run out and buy a car tomorrow? Or is it going to take time before the Fed lowering interest rates means car dealers lower interest rates, which means people go, okay? So we have lags. We have what are called recognition lags. The Fed has to realize that there's a problem that they need to deal with. And they're not going to go to sleep one night, right? It might take them weeks or even months to realize that, we have to do something about that. Okay? Hopefully it's quick, but it might take them some time. Number two is what's called implementation. So the Fed decides that, there's not enough reserves, they aren't ample, and they do something to get money out into the system. And that, it doesn't take them very long, but there is a delay in there. There is a lag. Okay? And then lastly, how long does it take before this is effective? And again, when the Fed changes interest rates, it doesn't change them by a large amount, and it takes time for that change to go from them through the banks to their customers. So it might take 6 or 9 months for an action the Fed takes, like increasing the money supply, to work its way through the economy and start affecting the economy the way they want it to affect the economy. And that's another concern about, maybe following a rule, maybe this delay, this lag in its effectiveness minimizes the ability of the rule. Okay? Then there's something called the PIP. And that's Gladys Knight and the Pips. If you don't know who Gladys Knight and the Pips are, you should Google them. But the PIP, the Policy Ineffectiveness Proposition. There are some economists who argue that because there's all these delays in the system and that Wall Street is quicker than everybody else, that a change made by the Fed could be counteracted by Wall Street. So again, if the smart guys on Wall Street know that the Fed is about to lower interest rates or jump in the repo market or whatever, if they get there first and set themselves up to make money off of whatever the Fed is about to do, it could limit the actions of the Fed, prevent the Fed from having a full impact that it wants to have. All right? Again, this is one of those them-there debate things among economists. Some economists are adamant that the PIP means that the government really can't affect the economy. Other people are like, okay. And in the end, this comes down to anticipated versus unanticipated. What do we know versus what don't we know? Everybody thinks that the Fed can have a big impact on the economy if what it does is unanticipated. Nobody sees it coming. The debate is what happens if it's anticipated. And this anticipated versus unanticipated is going to pop up again in the next chapter about things like inflation, what happens if we expect inflation versus what happens if we don't expect it, What are our expectations, right? We start building in. If we think inflation is coming every year, we start building that in. We anticipate it. We start building it into things. If we don't know what's going on with prices, then when inflation hits, it's unanticipated, and that should have a different effect on us. And so this is a whole other issue about, does it make a difference if we know what's about to happen versus if we don't, if it's anticipated versus unanticipated. Okay, that was fun. So let's go talk about fiscal policy for a while.